Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to also thank Roger Hertog, the Hertog Foundation, for supporting our program. Thanks also to the Mailman School of Public Health for co-sponsoring this lecture series and for providing these beverages. So I also obviously want to thank David Heymann for coming and joining us this evening. And unique among our speakers this year and last year, I should say, is he's the only one who asked me to go light on the introduction and not to heap praise on him. And so I'll do that. I'll honor his request. And I also just want to point out, he just comes to us after spending an hour with our students and telling us what I thought, without praising him too much, were really fascinating stories about his career. One that began as an officer for U.S. Public Health Service in looking at the first outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in Philadelphia, and continued on from there with Ebola, and spending 13 years as a medical epidemiologist in sub-Saharan Africa for the CDC. He went on working in the World Health Organization and building up their program in communicable diseases. For a time, he headed the polio eradication program. He ended up at WHO as Assistant Director General for Health Security and Environment. And finally, he's now chairman of the board of the UK's Health Protection Agency. So in all these ways, I think he's really the perfect person to address us tonight in talking about the history and future of global public health and pandemic threats. So thank you, David Heymann.
Thanks very much. First of all, don't pay any attention to the date. I really did put this together today, but I used a framework from before and forgot to change it. And Larry, who's in the front row, can vouch for that because I did it in his flat where I'm staying. So anyway, what Sydney would like me to talk about, is Sydney here? No, maybe not. Sydney sent a message off saying that this is what you should know, so this is what I will try to convey. First of all, diseases know no national boundaries, and second, the historical evolution of international collaboration. So I'd start then with epidemics and pandemics that really have shaped history. And this goes back to the first millennium, and there you can see there are waves of disease, plague, and other diseases that went around the world and are still known from their history. If you then look in the Middle Ages, you'll see that plague dominated the map, and plague came in waves across Europe in the Middle Ages, and then in the 20th century, the first major pandemic in the 20th century was, of course, the Spanish flu outbreak in the early 20th century. So you can see that pandemics have been important throughout history. Now, there are oftentimes difficulties in defining pandemics, and Larry Altman, does anybody know who Larry is? Larry's a journalist at the New York Times. He actually was a medical doctor from CDC, and he was very interested in trying to define a pandemic when people announced that there was a pandemic of swine flu. But there are some common things that everybody agrees on for a pandemic, and one of those is that it's a new infectious disease to which there is no antigenic recognition and or population immunity, which means that it's new, that nobody has antibody to it, and therefore everybody is susceptible. The second is that it must spread among populations throughout the world in order to be a pandemic. It's not a pandemic if it only occurs in the US. It's a what? An epidemic, right. The mortality rate is usually not a factor because it's the geographic spread that's important, but many pandemics in the past have had high rates of mortality. And there are often emerging infections associated at the human-animal interface. So those are some defining points for a pandemic. Can anybody think of any more defining points? You happy with these? Okay, well then let's go on because we'll talk about some of the diseases that really formed history and made history. I want you to think of 4 diseases that you believe throughout history have shaped the way we think about infectious diseases. Does anybody have any ideas? This is the first one. Yeah.
Plague.
Yeah. And
I would suggest smallpox.
Smallpox, okay. Anybody else have any idea? Flu? Okay. Huh? Throughout the history. What do you say? Schistosomiasis, yeah. Okay. Cholera. Leprosy. HIV in the present, yeah. Well, there were 4 back in the medieval times that shaped the way we think about infectious diseases in the world today. And the first was plague, and here you can see the plague doctor. Have you seen this picture before? Many of you had. Who knows what's in that mask? In the beak. Who knows? Hmm? I can't hear. Lavender? Lavender, well that's close. It's pepper. And it was pepper to keep the miasma, all these vapors, from being able to pass. It was thought that the pepper would stop that. At least that's the story I've heard. So anyway, plague was certainly one of the most important ones. And in the 14th century, it wiped out a lot of people in Venice, including in this painting, it shows you Titan, who was killed. Smallpox, you said it, very important disease. Throughout history, was eradicated in 1980. How many people know how many deaths there were from smallpox in 1967, the year that smallpox eradication began, and a year that a few in here can remember? How many deaths were there? DA probably told you this when he spoke with you a couple of weeks ago. Anybody remember? There were 3 million deaths in 1967 from smallpox. Can you imagine? If you were to look at a graph today, putting that 3 million deaths on a graph of the high infectious disease killers today, it would be number 2. What would be number 1? No. No? Diarrheal disease in children is number 1. Number 2 today is respiratory disease. Number 3 today is TB. Number 4 is HIV. And number 5 is malaria. And then number 6 is measles. But if you put 3 million deaths from smallpox in 1967 on the 2011 graph today, it would still be first or second. It would be second. It was an incredible disease, but it's eradicated because of what D.A. Henderson told you a few weeks ago, a very successful program on eradication. So the first was cholera, very important in shaping how we think about infectious diseases. Second, smallpox. Who wants to say the third? You said it, cholera. Cholera was very important and still important. An outbreak in Zimbabwe that continues to go on today, epidemics, and there was one in Haiti, as you know. So a very important disease that shaped history of infectious diseases. And nobody has yet said the fourth one, and it's one that concerns us mostly in the Americas. What is it?
Is it rotavirus?
No. Think back in the history. Think back to the Panama Canal construction.
Yellow fever.
Yellow fever. Yellow fever was the 4th major infectious diseases that formed the way we think about infectious diseases today. And these diseases were pandemic. They could cross borders. There was a major epidemic of yellow fever in Philadelphia. And this is in the middle there is the notification about that yellow fever. And it still goes on today, sporadically in Latin America, but also in Africa, in parts of Africa. And if it gets into an urban area, it causes a major threat. Who knows how yellow fever spreads? Does anybody know? Yeah. Mosquito, yeah. It's a disease that's in monkeys that live high in the canopy, in the forest. And they have their mosquitoes, and then there are mosquitoes on the ground. Well, when a monkey drops dead with yellow fever and falls down, the land mosquitoes can feed on it, and then they feed on humans, give them yellow fever, and then humans can pass it to other humans if they're not sleeping under bed nets. So a very important disease that shaped infectious diseases. And so there's always been a concern about these diseases throughout the ages. In the 14th century, remember the plague in Venice, that was the first time that anybody tried to do anything about it. And what did they try to do? Quarantine. And who knows what a quarantine is? Yes?
14 days.
How many?
40 days.
40 days, that's right. 40 days, keep that ship at bay, keep it out in the harbor, don't let it in. Did it work? No. Didn't work. The rats died. They had no idea why they were doing this. They just wanted to keep people out, thinking that if they kept them 40 days, they would either all die if they had a plague or they would not have it, and then they left them in. Or they took things out. So quarantine was attempted It didn't work, and as you know, the pandemics continued around the world. But then in the 19th century, there was really a lot of interest in Europe and the Americas, and there were 10 international sanitary conferences which were trying to understand how to prevent the spread of plague, cholera, yellow fever, and smallpox. And those sanitary conferences ended up with requirements that countries report to each other when a disease, one of these 4 diseases, cholera, plague, yellow fever, smallpox, were occurring. Then in 1920, the League of Nations began to think more about how they might expand this to the world, and in Geneva. And finally, in 1969, the World Health Organization developed the International Health Regulations, which are a convention, an international convention like the Tobacco Convention, and they have 193 signatories, the most of any convention. Every country in the world signed up to this convention. Does anybody know what the IHR are? Has anybody ever carried a yellow fever vaccination card? How many? You've all participated in the IHR, because that's part of the IHR, the yellow fever vaccination. But in effect, what the international health regulations were to ensure the maximum security against the international spread of disease with a minimum interference in world traffic. What does that mean? Not clear. But there was a book written about the regulations which had in it predetermined measures that a country could take if another country reported one of those 4 diseases. And there were also guides to ship sanitation and aviation sanitation, which required that certain measures were taken at seaports and airports so that if vectors of disease came in, they wouldn't be able to propagate within that environment, such as mosquitoes and rats. And you know the ships have the bell around the cord and various things to prevent these things from happening. So the international health regulations were to ensure the maximum security against the international spread of disease with minimum interference in world traffic. They required really 3 things. First was a notification to WHO whenever a country had cholera, plague, yellow fever, or smallpox before 1980, and reports were only accepted from countries where the event was occurring. Okay? So if the US had an outbreak of yellow fever, they were required to report to WHO. There was health organization at the borders, we talked about that, at seaports and at airports, frontier posts, to prevent vector proliferation, and there were health measures to describe the maximum measures that a country may require to protect against cholera, plague, yellow fever, and in the past, smallpox. And a good example is the yellow fever vaccination card. A country, when it reported to WHO under the International Health Regulations, had its report published in the weekly epidemiological record, which comes out weekly from WHO, on the back page in very small print. And there you can see a report. I think it's cholera. Is it in Senegal? Yeah. It's cholera in Senegal. It's very small. It's hard to read on the back page. And the people who work at the seaports and airports are expected to be reading this. We're expected to read this. And then we're expected to, if it were yellow fever, require a vaccination card if you're coming from that country. Or if it were cholera in the past, they used to require a cholera vaccination. That's no longer required because it wasn't effective. But these were the things that could be done, predetermined measures, when it was published. And here's how it worked. A country, and countries only could report cholera, plague, yellow fever, or smallpox. It was published in the weekly epidemiological record. There's the publication. And the country was able to stop it if they wanted to. They stopped the outbreak. They tried to stop it. And other countries could apply predetermined measures. A very passive system. Very, very passive system. Now, do you think the regulations were an effective means of dealing with the international spread of infectious diseases? Did they work? Does anybody know? Anybody have any ideas? Yes?
I would say no, because it's possible for an individual to incubate or carry the disease without it being reported, and that can spread.
Good point. That's right. especially in today's world. That's why in 1969 there was a little bit different thinking than there is today. Because you can be carrying a disease from one country to another in the incubation period, and nobody can pick it up until you get sick. Anything else? What happened if a country did? Yeah.
Well, it also doesn't regulate proactive measures within a country. So apart from the incubation period, you also can't tell if measures are being taken from country to country. And if you don't have uniform measures, then you can assume certain things about every country about the spread of the disease, which aren't necessarily true.
That's right. And you can't even assume that a country has good public health. It's a very difficult issue. So I think in general, in 2003, and it's important that we stop at 2003 because that was a turning point in many ways. But in 2003, it was clear that the international health regulations were not effective. What happened if a country refused to report a disease? Anybody know? What do you think happened? Nothing, yeah. There's no international police force. There's no police force that can go after a country if they don't report. So countries didn't report, and they had reason not to report. And we'll talk about that. But first, I just want to say about between 1996 and 2003, there were many other diseases that were occurring in addition to cholera, plague, and yellow fever that were important in the world. Look at some of these. There were flu, there was SARS, there were all kinds of diseases that were occurring that weren't even covered by the international health regulations. And in addition, when a country did report, what happened? They lost money. This shows you the culling of cattle in the UK in the 1990s when they reported BSE because they had to get rid of the disease and they culled cattle. This could be pictures of chickens burning for H5N1. It's a very expensive thing to report. And countries didn't want to report because they lost money. When SARS occurred, look at the economic impact that occurred in Asia. The graph shows you the airport arrivals in Hong Kong, which went down when WHO said don't travel there, but then they came back up. But still, that cost the economy in Asia $60 billion. So these things were there was no incentive to report. If you reported, what happened? You ended up with sanctions, and this is the map. UK, 39 billion they lost from mad cow. When Peru reported cholera, first time in 100 years that cholera entered the Americas, they lost $770 million because your country and my country, at least our country here, this country, stopped all importation of seafood and freshwater fish, and tourists stopped going, and they lost $770 million in their first year of cholera. Cholera is now endemic throughout Latin America. These were unwarranted sanctions, yet they occurred. So why should a country report a disease? Plague in India, they lost $1.7 billion when they reported a disease for no reason at all, because it wasn't spreading. There was no reason not to go to India. There was no reason to ban imports from India, yet people did it. So there was no incentive to report. And what happened was the first case of a disease occurred. Countries would wait to see whether or not they would report. Some would report, some wouldn't. But no matter what happened, there was a delayed response, and you lost an opportunity for control, and you made this a risk of international spread. Clearly, what was wanted was early reporting, a rapid response, and potential cases prevented in all countries, not just in a few, so that throughout the world there could be a level playing ground. So now, what would you do next? We've got the international health regulations in 1969. Countries sometimes reported, most times didn't. If they did report, they had terrible trade sanctions. So what would you do next? And remember, the IHR were an important tool because 194 countries in the world signed up to these. Unheard of for a convention. Yeah?
You have to somehow augment the incentive structure to get people in.
Yeah, that's one thing. Make it important for countries to report. What else? What would you do at this situation? You've got a set of regulations which aren't working. What would you do? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about the regulations, and then you'll understand maybe what to do next. Because the international health regulations were created by a very ingenious group. These regulations made some requirements, but they also said that they could be modified and that it never had to go again for resignature. They could be modified, and countries could disadhere from sections that they didn't like. So if you were to modify it, all that had to happen was a country just adhere. So you could do whatever you wanted to with this if you had a consensus to do it, and they could serve as a valuable tool. So it was decided that there would be a revision of the 1969 International Health Regulations. And so how would you do that revision? Anybody have any ideas? What would be your vision for that revision? You're in the 21st century, 20th century. Well, there was a vision that was developed back in 1996 when we started talking about revising them. And that was a world on the alert and able to detect and respond to international infectious disease threats within 24 hours, using the most up-to-date means of global communication and collaboration. And Steve knows this well because he was already doing this, Steve, back in the 90s with ProMed, which had been set up to do just this, alert and detect diseases, and then to respond to those diseases. But the second, this at least was able to set up a global mechanism to do it. But the second thing was that understanding that there couldn't be a police force, there had to be some way in which the norms surrounding report of infectious diseases could be changed, making it expected and respected to report. Not just being reporting, but making it expected. Make sure that countries would hold other countries accountable for reporting. Because those were the two keys to the revision as it was seen. In other words, set in operation a way of working that could then be incorporated into the IHR. Well, one of the first things after ProMed was set up that was developed was the Global Public Health Information Network in Canada. And I know there are some Canadians here as well. The Canadian government, in support of WHO, developed a web crawling mechanism which now crawls the web in 7 languages looking for outbreaks of infectious diseases using keywords. That information was then translated overnight, or during the day rather, in Canada, and sent overnight to Geneva for action within the WHO system. And this is how it worked. In February of 1999, the Canadian Global Public Health Information Network reported a highly fatal respiratory disease in Afghanistan. Now the fear was that this was some kind of a deliberate use of anthrax or some type of a disease because it was in a very shady part of the world in Afghanistan. Was somebody working to try to use weapons? Were they developing weapons? What happened? So there was great concern on this, and WHO sent a local team for a preliminary investigation. The collaborative team then went in and investigation was completed and diagnosis was confirmed. But let's move back to the 16th of February. Where do you think GFIN picked up that report of a highly fatal respiratory disease? It was, yeah.
In India?
No, but it was close. It was in Tajikistan, just next door. It had been written in a local language newspaper on the border with Afghanistan that there was an outbreak going on. It was translated into English and made it to an English language website in Dushanbe, and GFIN picked it up there. That information was acted on. It turned out that this was just a simple seasonal influenza epidemic in a part of the world that hadn't had influenza, seasonal influenza for 30 years. So the people weren't protected. They died. It was highly fatal, but it turned out to be influenza. But the power of this system, not only detecting but able to respond within a fairly short period of time. So all of a sudden, WHO, through GFIN and through ProMed and others, found that they really had many, many more reports from sources away from countries than they did from countries. The red shows you country reporting through the WHO system, and the green shows you reporting that was picked up electronically around the world. Now, remember what the International Health Regulations said about reporting diseases. Who reported diseases to WHO?
The country with the outbreak.
Countries only, yeah. And here was a new way of working, and it was a very risky way. Well, the legal department at WHO didn't like this because we were breaking the law, international law. We were taking reports from other places, acting upon them, and not only from countries. What would you do in that situation? Well, you get a good evidence base first as to why you might want to break the law. but then you should try to recruit the Director General and others and continue, which we did. And there was a good Director General who said, yes, you can continue along that way. So that was the way that reporting became a global thing, breaking the rules, but it still wasn't legalized. And then this whole system developed where WHO was taking information from formal sites and from informal sites around the world, including ProMed, which Steve was active with at that time, GFIN, from NGOs like the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, or Médecins Sans Frontières, whatever groups, all around, collecting information, acting on it. And when the information came into WHO, if it was confirmed, then WHO went out to a group of partners, the people that were working in these networks, and asked if anyone could help partner with WHO to work on the outbreak response should the country request it. New way of working. A new way of working that could, hopefully, be incorporated into international health regulations, which was a way that WHO began to work. And here were some of the outbreaks in the 98, 99 that WHO and its partners, recruited through electronic means, were able to deal with infections around the world. Now, what happened in March 2003 was very important for the international health regulations. Because in March 2003, as you remember, a doctor from the Guangdong province in China, who had been treating people with an unknown pneumonia, went into Hong Kong and stayed overnight in a hotel one night. He was going to a wedding the next day, but he was quite sick. It's thought that he vomited in the hallway, but somehow in that hotel he was able to infect people with the same disease, yet unknown, that spread around the world to Canada, Ireland, the US, Singapore, Vietnam, and into parts of Hong Kong. So one person coming out of China spread this disease around the world, 2003. If any of you remember, it caused quite a bit of panic in the world. This is one area of transmission on a plane, China Airways 112 from Hong Kong to Beijing. Either in the waiting room or on the plane, the person circled infected flight attendants and passengers on that plane. This was just one example. Spread around the world. And then WHO called into operation its partners who were working in this global outbreak alert and response network to help with this outbreak. And this shows you where the experts came from. 26 institutions in 17 countries permitted WHO to put field teams in 5 countries where the outbreaks were occurring, and permitted information in real time that could then be converted into recommendations on what to do about travel. And so WHO really overstepped its grounds. This was a disease not contained at all in the international health regulations, which had been received through electronic reporting. I didn't give you the way that it was detected, but it was detected by ProMed and GFIN and a whole group of people that provided this information to WHO. And WHO used the evidence to act and to make recommendations on travel. The outbreak did stop. WHO would love to claim the credit and possibly did do a lot in stopping this, because there was a very bold Director General who actually not only made some very important decisions, but if you remember that vision we talked about changing the norm for reporting, make it expected and respected to report, she accused China in public, finger-pointing China, saying, you're not reporting this disease, and this is spreading around the world. It's all it took to China. The next day, the Vice Premier was on a plane up to Geneva to talk with the Director General, and China controlled the disease. So that was the beginning of a new way of working, partnership around the world, electronic surveillance, and a responsibility to report, expected and respected. And so, fortuitously, the outbreak was occurring from March to June, and May is when the World Health Assembly meets in Geneva. So this gave the opportunity to WHO to really concretize the way that it had been working unofficially and against legal's wishes by a resolution that everybody signed because everybody was afraid, and it permitted WHO to report infectious diseases from other sources than member states. All infectious diseases with potential for international spread should be reported, and revised international health regulations were to serve as a formal framework for proactive international surveillance and response through national focal points. So a whole new way of working in a resolution. Now, who knows what a resolution is? Does this do anything? Does this require anything of countries? No, it doesn't. It's political will, but it gave WHO a mandate to move ahead with a revision of the international health regulations. And so in 2005, that revision was accomplished. It went from reporting of 3 diseases. What were they? Cholera, plague, yellow fever, smallpox, but smallpox was not on in 19 when the revision occurred. It went to all public health threats, not only infectious diseases, but others. It went from a passive system. Remember how passive it was? A country reported, it then got published, and then if you read it, you could respond to it. It went proactive, using real-time surveillance and real-time evidence, as had been done in SARS when it was determined where people should not travel, using real-time evidence. And it went from trying to control at the borders to detection and containment at the source. 3 major changes in the philosophy of the IHR. All public health threats, proactive, and detection and containment at the source rather than waiting till it spreads internationally. Those regulations require mandatory reporting of possible public health emergency of international importance, and this shows you a decision tree developed up in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute for WHO, which shows a series of questions in the decision tree that helps countries and WHO working together decide whether what they have is a possible public health emergency of international importance, a FAIC, P-H-E-I-C. It's the second requirement in the revised regulations is strengthen national core capacity for surveillance and control. This means that countries are required in the 7 years after the regulations came into force, which was in 2007, they're required to have a minimum public health laboratory and minimum surveillance system within their countries, and they are being monitored by the World Health Assembly, the governing body of WHO, to be sure that they do that. It required a national focal point to ensure that there was 24-hour communication. Remember the vision, 24 hours communication on the alert within each country, and there's a committee that's been set up to oversee these regulations. This is how you decide if you have what's called a FAIC, a public health emergency of international concern. There are 4 diseases that always must be required. Why do you suppose those diseases need to be reported? Polio, smallpox, because they're eradicating or eradicated diseases. Influenza, because you can see what happens when a new subtype enters. And SARS, which was thought possibly to be a reoccurring disease, which it turned out was a one-time event. So those were the 4 diseases that went in by name. Then there are diseases that should always lead to utilization of an algorithm, of this algorithm on the right, and those are cholera, pneumonic plague, yellow fever, viral hemorrhagic fever, others, looking to see their public health impact, unusual or unexpected, risk of international spread, risk of travel and trade, and then if there's insufficient information, there needs to be a reassessment as more information comes. This tool is used by WHO and countries to decide whether they have a public health emergency of international concern, which must then be reported. So all of a sudden, there's been a new way of working developed, which is now proactive instead of passive. Public health risks can be reported by countries, and countries are expected to report, whether it's an outbreak or a chemical spill or whatever that might cross borders, but also public health risk reporting comes in from WHO's surveillance around the world and others that feed into that network. Then there's a decision tree analysis with the country, and you saw the decision tree here, to determine whether it's urgent international public health importance, and if it is, then a country is required to work with WHO to develop the measures that will prevent that disease from spreading outside that country. And they're required to stop that outbreak from occurring. And if it's not public health emergency of international importance, then countries can do what they wish with that disease. But they're being monitored to strengthen their public health system. So do you think that these revised regulations meet the vision for their revision that was put up way, way back? You remember it was a world on the alert, able to detect and respond to infectious diseases, and reporting expected and respected. Do you think that they're meeting some of those goals? Do you think there are weaknesses in them? Anybody have any ideas? It's late in the day.
Well, there are only 7 languages, right? I mean, for instance, the surveillance that's being done, I mean,
Yeah.
ideally you'd have, you know, kind of...
Yeah, so there are certainly
Yeah.
gaps in what's going on, yeah. There are lots of gaps in them. But they are regulations, they're international law, but international law cannot be enforced, unfortunately. So do you think the IHR will be used or are being used? Well, let's look at an example. Back in, this is the wrong slide, I'm sorry. This should be H5N1, and it should be phase 3. Because H5N1 was a phase 3 alert back in 2007. It was a phase 3. This is the wrong slide. So it was a human infection with a new virus, but there was only infrequent spread. Remember, this is a disease that comes from chickens into humans, and it was spreading occasionally in other humans, in Vietnam one time, and in others. Bird flu, very serious issue. In countries were providing the virus to WHO because WHO needs those viruses in order to determine what's going on in the world and also to develop a strain for vaccine. So it was required. Now, back in 2007, when it was declared a phase 3, the Minister of Health of Indonesia said that Indonesia, which had the most cases of bird flu at that time, was going to stop sharing viruses internationally. How many remember that? And she said that because, and she was right, she's right. She said, why should we be sharing viruses and let a vaccine be developed and we won't have any benefit from that vaccine? And she had experience because in 2007, her president told her, I want you to get 2 million doses of H5N1 vaccine, and I want it stored in Indonesia. In case there's an outbreak, I want our health workers, and of course his family and others, to be vaccinated. So she was sent on a mission to get a vaccine that was made with the strain from Indonesia. She went to a pharmaceutical company that I won't name, who had the virus, who had developed a vaccine, and they said, fine. They said, you can have the vaccine, here's the cost, same cost as in the US and everywhere else. And besides, not only that, you're number 32 on the waiting list, because there are 32 countries ahead of you that have asked for a vaccine and paid for it. So she couldn't fulfill the national need that her president perceived, and it made her very concerned, and she's rightfully concerned. She wanted to know, she wanted people to know that if her virus was used for vaccine, they should also get some of the vaccine. So in March of 2007, they were able to articulate through a meeting in Jakarta what benefits they wanted. They wanted strengthened laboratory capacities in their own countries, in developing countries, to qualify for WHO Collaborating Center designation. Now, a WHO Collaborating Center is a laboratory paid for by a country that does work for WHO. In the US, there are about 22 WHO collaborating centers at CDC that deal with things ranging from flu to Ebola, and there are collaborating centers in most industrialized countries in the world because they have the skills to do them. But she wanted some collaborating centers in developing countries, but developing countries never had stood up at that point and said, we'll put the money into those labs because WHO doesn't put money in. It's them. But she wanted WHO to put money into developing country labs so that they could reach the same standard as industrialized country labs. A questionable request, but that was what she made. Second was she wanted more transparent virus handling within WHO because when these viruses came to WHO, nobody knew where they went. They just came in and stayed there. But they went into industry, they went into developing of tests and a whole series of things. She wanted sustained access to pandemic vaccines, and she wanted to link virus sharing and vaccine production to sustainability of those benefits. Now, she was right in many ways, but she put the world at risk because there was a gap in knowledge about what was going on in Indonesia. So, do the revised international health regulations, can they play a role in this? And if not, tell what more could be done. Think back to the revised regulations. Remember, one of the reported diseases, required reporting, was influenza of a new character, so it was required to be reported. But do you think they could play a role in this, or did they play a role in this? Well, let's move on. Article 2 says that the regulations require countries to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to international spread of disease commensurate with public health risks. This is a requirement. WHO must be sure that that's met. The only way that you can prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public health response to the international spread of disease is to know where that disease is occurring. To know where H5N1 was occurring, you needed to have laboratory tests that could detect H5N1, and the only way you could develop those tests was if you had viruses that you could test them against. So, number one, you needed to have those viruses coming into WHO. In addition, there was a requirement to protect, and the only way you can protect is with vaccine. And the only way you could get a vaccine was to develop a strain which could be used to develop vaccine. Now think about the H5N1 virus. What does it do to chickens? Kills them. How is influenza vaccine made? It's made in eggs. It's grown in fertilized eggs, in embryos. If you have a virus that kills chickens, you can't grow it in eggs. It has to be genetically modified in a way that it won't kill those eggs so you can develop a vaccine. The only way you can do that is if you have live virus and use it for those vaccines. So there was every reason that Indonesia had to share that vaccine. It said it right here, Annex 2. Help to determine if an event constitutes an emergency, requires joint risk assessment, a whole series of reasons why that virus was needed. And clearly, Indonesia was in abeyance of the international health regulations that had just been revised through a tremendous amount of work. Did WHO countries decide to use these regulations to enforce reporting or to say, let's get on with the job? No. Countries decided instead, through a resolution, less strong, to develop an intergovernmental process which has involved the meetings since 2007, and you can see that the intergovernmental meetings have now ended in 2011, and they finally come to a way of maybe sustaining a little bit of this, but still haven't met the requirement of pandemic vaccine. So a whole series of things that cost over $5 million instead of using the international health regulations. So countries may not use it, and I guess I would ask you why you thought they chose not to use them. They worked hard to revise them. Why didn't they use them? Anybody have any ideas? Well, think of the U.S. Does the U.S. want people to put sanctions on them if they don't report a disease? And do they report all diseases? Who knows? They don't sometimes. So, you know, countries, when it came to implementing these or enforcing these regulations, all of a sudden put themselves in the seat of Indonesia and said, well, if we do this to Indonesia, maybe they'll do it back to us. And so in the end, they made it a less strong response and they didn't use the international health regulations. Are there any questions at this point? I think we're probably running out of time, are we? What time is it? And when do we end? 7? 7:30, okay. So are there any observations at this point? How could you make sure they're used the next time? Is there any way? It's really tough. It's really tough. We've got a beautiful international tool, just like we have a beautiful tobacco convention. And now the U.S. is going to decide whether or not they're going to sign up to that convention. But it's really tough to make things happen internationally, and really tough. But anyway, the regulations are there, and they're there just in time because of the emerging infections agenda. And you all know this. Did somebody talk to you about emerging infections? Well, these are the important ones for international health regulations because they zoom across borders very easily. And they usually occur at the human-animal interface. This shows you some of the selected ones since 1976. And you can see that there are many different ones occurring. Jones et al. In Nature in 2008 showed that these emerging infections were all classes of organism that we know. They're bacterial, they're viral, they're parasitic, and they're fungal. All these emerging infections can be of any, and they occur everywhere in the world. And there are some hotspots, but they do occur everywhere in the world. Now, the reason that these diseases are so difficult to deal with is because they can take 3 different pathways. Does anybody know those pathways? Well, the first pathway is they can cross the barrier between an animal and a human. They infect a human, and they go no further. What's a good example of that? Does anybody know any examples of that?
H5N1.
Sorry?
H5N1.
H5N1 at present, yeah. Anything else? Monkeypox, that's right. Usually doesn't spread. Or, no, I'm sorry, monkeypox does spread, but you'll see. This is no further transmission at all. And you gave a good example. Salmonella from eggs is another example. A good example in Europe, because I developed this for a European audience, was Legionnaire's disease, which was in the air conditioning at the Capellen Trade Fair in Belgium in 1999, and infected people who went back to various European countries. But a disease which comes probably from a pigeon or an animal into the water of the air conditioning system, and somehow through a leak gets out and infects a whole group of people who are attending an event such as this one, the Legionnaire's disease. So a disease that emerges and has no further human-to-human transmission. Then there are others that emerge, they continue transmission for a while, and then they cease or become sporadic. And this is the monkeypox example. But there are other examples of that as well. Who else can give other examples? Monkeypox can transmit for maybe 2 or 3 generations, and then it's too weak to continue transmission and it dies out. Huh? SARS? SARS was a disease that didn't have enough time to show whether it would do that or not. It continued to spread for a while, but whether or not it would have slowed down, nobody knows, because it stopped before then.
West Nile?
West Nile? Let's see, West Nile comes, yeah, I guess it could be spread from human to human by mosquitoes, but it's usually from an animal, yeah, to human. Yeah?
SIV to HIV.
SIV?
And HIV.
HIV spreads from human to human, and it hasn't stopped yet. We don't know in the history of things, but it's still going. I'll give you the example that we used in Europe in a meeting. Human influenza AH7N7 and AH3 were in poultry in the Netherlands. They infected humans and they transmitted a bit, but then they stopped. And this is common to these influenza viruses in poultry. But then there's one that emerges, and it continues transmission, and then it becomes endemic. And you've already said the classic example of that is HIV. And this shows you HIV. It probably most likely came from a non-human primate into humans in the late 19th or early 20th century, and then gradually became endemic, and then became a pandemic when it started amplifying in cities where there was risky behavior and airplanes that took it around the world. And HIV is now an endemic disease, infecting populations all over the world. This again is a European example. So you've got 3 different patterns of emergence. No further transmission, continue to transmit, cease and sporadic, or continues transmission and continues and becomes endemic. SARS was a disease that there was concern that it might do just what HIV did, spread around the world and then become endemic either in humans or in animals, who could then spread it periodically to humans. But fortunately it didn't get into Africa, where surveillance was weak. It was found in most places and didn't. But the other thing about these emerging infections is they can increase virulence or decrease virulence. So an H5N1 that is very virulent now could become less virulent as it passes through humans, and it replicates and mutates, or it could become even more virulent. Nobody knows what will happen. So these are the very tricky diseases, and these are the essence of those 4 diseases in history: cholera, plague, yellow fever, and smallpox in the 21st century. These are the diseases where there's focus today. These are the diseases that people are concerned about under the international health regulations. Now I'm just going to finish, because we're facing some new events which are going to make life even more complicated. And those include such things as climate change and health and extreme weather events, which are now giving us a glimpse, no matter what the Bush government said, they're giving us a glimpse of what's going to happen in the future. And this shows you what they occur as: increase in storms, flooding, drought at the same time, food shortages, increase in temperature, heat waves, a whole series of things. And they're really personified very well in the Rift Valley fever in Sudan in 1998. Who knows what Rift Valley fever is? Steve?
So it's a disease transmitted by mosquitoes. It's viral.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it first got a lot of attention in Egypt in 1977. It caused a very large outbreak, but it had been known before in Africa.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Rift Valley fever is a viral disease carried by cattle and ruminants, ruminant animals, cattle, sheep, goats. And it spreads to humans by two means: either a mosquito that first bit the cattle and then the human, or by the blood during slaughter of an animal. So it's a virus that infects humans, and it's a very serious infection. About 30 to 35% can die. It's a very serious viral disease. And this young man in Sudan became infected, and he did die. But this outbreak occurred at the time when there was flooding in East Africa due to an El Nino event. And what does flooding do? Why did this outbreak occur at this time?
Breeding ground for mosquitoes?
That's one thing, breeding ground for mosquitoes. What else? Huh? Drowns cattle? Yeah, it could drown cattle, but what happens is the cattle and the humans move closer together on dry land. So you got the perfect storm, if you would, for an outbreak. I like to call this a Swiss cheese event. You know what a Swiss cheese event is? If you want to pass a pencil through 5 pieces of Swiss cheese, what do you have to do? You line up 5 holes. And so this was the beginning of a Swiss cheese event. And it's a very complicated event. First of all, there was flooding, pushed humans and animals closer together. Animals were infected with Rift Valley fever, and there was an increase in mosquitoes that could transmit the virus from animals to humans. You with me? The next hole, routine vaccination of Rift Valley fever in East Africa. This is a requirement. If you want to export animals from East Africa, they have to be vaccinated against Rift Valley fever. And this shows you the vaccination that was occurring in East Africa, but there was insufficient veterinary vaccine produced in the 1990s in Kenya, and cattle were no longer being vaccinated as they should be. There was still vaccine, but the majority of cattle weren't vaccinated. So here were these cattle forced into close proximity with humans and increase in mosquitoes. So there was an outbreak of Rift Valley fever in Sudan. But animal husbandry is one of the major sources of revenue for Sudan. And where does that revenue come from? Where does it trade? It trades across the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula.
To Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia and Yemen and all over the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So there was a lot of trade going on with livestock. And these are the cattle, and there were also goats. And this is especially true at what time of year? Hajj, that's right. It's very important when the religious sacrifices occur. Now this is the Port Said port, and you see 2 types of boats here, and they're shown for a reason, because the bigger ships take legal trade across the Red Sea, but the smaller boats take illegal trade across the Red Sea. Legal trade requires that animals are vaccinated. Illegal trade doesn't. But even legal trade, you can buy a vaccination certificate very easily. So even legal trade is dangerous. But this is the increase in those Swiss cheese holes now. Unvaccinated cattle and trade across Yemen and the Red Sea. And there was an outbreak of Rift Valley fever in animals and humans in 2000 in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Same genetic strain as occurred in East Africa in Rift Valley fever outbreaks 2 years earlier. So a complicated series of events, but these are the events for which the international health regulations were developed. But the most important thing in them is to help countries strengthen their own public health so that these diseases don't spread internationally. So that's what I wanted to say about the IHR. And I'm happy to answer any questions any of you might have.
Okay, if you have questions, I'd ask you to speak into the microphone since we're webcasting this so people can hear at home. As people make their way, let me just ask a question of my own. So when you describe what happened with Indonesia, you know, viral sovereignty, it occurred to me that that you know, maybe it's occurred to many other people too, but that you could take that as at least potentially a solution, or the beginning of one, where you could incentivize countries to report disease by promising them that they would be the first in line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they'd have other benefits too in upgrading laboratories and so on. So is that potentially something that could be done to help, you know, bring about greater compliance with international health regulations?
I think it's very important. It certainly can. If, you know, I'll go back to the Biological Weapons Convention because Steve was a big help in helping us understand that. There was a clause in the Biological Weapons Convention before it collapsed in the verification procedure that said that countries, from industrialized country signatories, would provide resources to signatories from developing countries for better public health. So incentives were attempted in that. Unfortunately, the negotiations collapsed, and it never met its, it may come back one day, but it collapsed. But yes, incentives are important sometimes to use. In the issue of virus sharing, what the Minister of Health was attempting to do was to imitate a very important convention or treaty that's been signed in the seed industry and the FAO. And this has signatories from the US, it has many, many signatories. Does anybody know about that? It's a very interesting mechanism that the Indonesians wanted to have used. And it has to do with the biodiversity, the Convention on Biodiversity, sitting up in Montreal, I think it is, or Canada. Under that, seeds were treated as sovereign goods. So if a seed came from your country, it belonged to you. Even if it blew in from some other country, it belonged to you. And you had rights over that seed. So the FAO, with the consent of seed industry, because they saw a benefit to this, developed a convention which said that FAO would take all sequence information from all seeds and store it in a seed bank, and also seeds themselves. And if a country or an industry wanted those seeds, they could take those seeds and they could develop new seeds from them, but they would have to pay 10% of their profits from those new seeds into a sustainability fund if they patented. If they didn't patent, they had to pay nothing into that fund, but were welcome to pay if they wanted to. Well, that sustainability fund was set up, and it's quite successful. It's an automated process, and you know, information goes in and out, in and out, in and out, and there's a fund that's been set up in the FAO. It's not yet fully operational because countries haven't all signed on it, but it was the model that the Indonesians were trying to use for virus sharing. There was only one difficulty, and that was that as of that time, the CBD had not yet looked at viruses, looked at bacteria, to see whether or not they were also sovereign property. But there were the Nagoya rounds, which occurred last year, which did say that virus can be sovereign property. So now there is a way that if groups begin to work on this, they have something in the CBD that says that viruses belong to a country. And if that country gives them, they must have some benefit from them. So that's how things work internationally. Changes are occurring. This was the vision of the Minister of Health of Indonesia, but she dropped it after a couple sessions, and she just was after other things, and just more importantly, to keep this visible globally. So yeah, there can be incentives, and I think sustainability funds, things like that, are very important.
Okay. Yeah. Helen.
Thanks. I just wanted to slightly follow up on that. Thanks a lot for a very clarifying talk, actually, about a very complicated subject, which is that were there, in fact, changes in the 2005 regulations which made the mechanism for giving assistance to countries with outbreaks more streamlined, I guess? I mean, it's something you sort of didn't quite say.
Yeah.
But
You can't force a country to take support to stop an outbreak, even under the international health regulations. But it's just this new norm and standard that's being set, and that's what's most important, expected and respected. You know, and if a country doesn't allow support from WHO and partners to go in and stop it, they will be ostracized internationally. Unfortunately, many Director General won't point a finger like Brundtland did. Who was the Director General back in 1997, or 2003 rather. But I always like to tell a story about Brundtland. Brundtland was a real dynamo. She was a real public health person because she was a pediatrician with an MPH from Harvard, yet she was a prime minister previously and knew how to deal with politics. When she accused China publicly of not having reported, she already knew that she wasn't running for a second term. She already decided that she wouldn't run. So, you know, there are politics involved. I myself believe that Brundtland would have done it no matter what. She was very confident, and she would have done it, and she would have won again. But some directors general may not find it useful to accuse a country in their first term.
yeah.
And so they can't make it expected.
But that's the stick element. But what about the carrot element? Was that also changed? In other words, did the regulations also say countries will get?
Yeah, they
that
will
was
get a
enhanced.
response. They will get a global response.
Yeah.
They also, hopefully, the bilateral donors like USAID and others will buy into strengthening the infrastructure in public health so that countries can do a better job themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is an incentive. And if countries take the international health regulations and go to DFID, the UK development agency, and say, here's our plan for strengthening our resources in public health, they'll get money. If they go to USAID, it's variable. It depends on the country office.
Okay, thanks.
So we have to play a role. We have to get our development agencies to understand that they're important in this for incentivizing.
Thank you very much. If it's okay, I have two questions, actually. So, first of all, returning to, in earlier slides in your talk, you mentioned defining a pandemic, and then what you saw as the four most important pandemics. And I was just wondering why, and I'll mention just a detail or two, but why you didn't include the 1918 influenza pandemic on that list, because in your definition you said that something about novel antigenic recognition and that there was no population immunity beforehand, and also the four that you listed, to my knowledge, they're not cyclic diseases, like they don't recur every season. And I think that the 1918 pandemic was a really good example of how like antigenic drift and things like that can cause a pandemic out of normal epidemic recurring diseases. So I feel like that would be extremely important.
Let me try to answer that. What I was trying to show you was I was trying to put it in the context of historical, before the 20th century. And flu probably occurred in pandemics, but it was never really described as was cholera, plague, yellow fever. Those were really clearly described in the literature, but flu was never really clearly described, and so it didn't play a major role in the IHR or in the conventions in the 19th century.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
But flu is very important, yes.
Right. And the other one is, so you discussed the IHR revisions during 2005, and you said that regarding like specific diseases and response plans and things like that, specific things were highlighted, like SARS, for example, and new incidences of the flu. And I was just wondering why you thought that this wasn't made more fluid. In other words, it wasn't left open completely to say any novel outbreak, like SARS, for example, was a novel outbreak. So they'll have precedence over any novel outbreak to take what measures they see fit.
SARS would have fit into that decision tree. It was made, the decision tree is very important. And SARS would have fit the criteria in that decision tree. In fact, I teach at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and there's a student there doing his master's who's looking at outbreaks that have occurred in the past 10 years and trying to see how many of those would have fit into these are outbreaks which were recorded as crossing borders. How many would have fit into that decision tree? So it does include other diseases, and SARS would have probably fit into that.
Sir, I have a question regarding the health minister's request for funds for creating a local collaborative center, I believe the term was, and in general creating more domestic and regional capabilities for developing vaccines on a local level. It seems to me that by starting to monitor and moving away from self-reporting, the initiative has kind of been taken away from the individual countries, and it's more of an active approach, as you mentioned. So really, countries can't decide anymore whether or not to report. So it seems to me it would make sense to provide these capabilities, and I don't know, maybe you can share some light into whether or not that's feasible.
Well, electronic reporting in itself is incentivizing because countries don't want somebody else to report their diseases today. They'd rather report it first. And so what's happened is, I showed you a graph of 2003. If you look today, the majority of diseases being reported by countries. It's changed again. It's come back to countries, but now they're reporting more completely. And less is being detected by electronic means. It's being detected, but it's already been reported. So there has been a change. Does that answer your question?
I was wondering whether or not funds are going to be made available, or whether the process started of funds being made available for countries such as Indonesia to create domestic capabilities of creating vaccines and kind of tackling the problem when it occurs.
Well, there actually were. The U.S. and Japan provided funding to WHO to help developing countries transfer technology for influenza vaccine, for pandemic vaccine. And that program went underway, but it was a very difficult program because industry dug its heels in most instances and didn't want to transfer the technology. Because their solution was to develop their own companies, their own factories in those countries, rather than have national do it. So it wasn't entirely effective, but there was a transfer of technology on a couple instances into Indonesia and Thailand. One was from Russia, technology transfer into Thailand, and Indonesia from Japan. So there were some successful, and the World Bank bought into that as well, so that countries could develop industries to produce vaccines. Is that?
And then did those countries then just choose to violate patents like Brazil would in some cases,
well,
or did they?
It's interesting. Flu vaccine is not, there's nothing patented in flu vaccine today. It's only when you have new genetic material that it's, so there were no patents involved. Okay. It was just the fact that what was patented were procedures, and some of the companies wouldn't transfer those procedures.
Thank you.
But that's the solution, local production.
This was fascinating and a little bit out of my domain. I have something of an ignorant question. You mentioned the seed bank and the like. As I recall, and it's hard for me to date it, but pharmaceutical companies in building their real laboratories, not their in silico libraries, rather, not their in silico libraries of possible agents, have been going all over islands and the like and cutting various kinds of deals with the countries. And I don't know, some of them I think may be licensing, some of them patents. But surely that can be a model used. It may be fairly sophisticated. Now, of course, we know that the chances of what's in a plastic bucket from some island will probably not turn out to be a sellable drug. But anyway, there's a lot of expertise there that might be, it seems to me, of use to the not-for-profit community.
Yeah, NIH actually has a program where they screen products that come from
especially for cancer. Yeah.
And I think that's reasonable. That's how we got a new anti-malarial. Artesunates are coming from a Chinese cucumber, and then now there's an attempt to synthesize it chemically to produce it. But those things are very important. Yeah, and pharmaceutical companies are really a part of the solution. They're not a problem in this, except that they do tend not to pay attention to developing country needs in many instances.
Good evening, sir. I was wondering if we talked about proactive measures, and I understand there's trouble with funding and getting other countries to get involved and accept a lot of the World Health Organization's policies. However, I was wondering if there's anything that they're doing actively as far as vaccinations go, preemptive and possible hazardous areas, things like that, that the World Health has taken over.
Yellow fever is a good example. Yellow fever used to be just a vaccine which was used to protect travelers and people like that. Now it's been integrated into routine immunization programs throughout the belt in Africa and in Latin America where yellow fever occurs. Same is happening with meningitis. There are places where meningitis occurs more frequently in Africa, in the Saharan area. Now there are vaccines being integrated into programs.
Is it getting funded directly through the countries or through the World Health Organization?
The World Health Organization makes the recommendation. The vaccines are then provided initially by what's called Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines, and then countries are expected to pay for them eventually.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm just wondering, how long does the IHR remain relevant in terms of endemic diseases? If you look at the case of HIV, clearly HIV isn't on the list, but H5N1 is. H5N1's been around for 14 years, and clearly some would argue that it's endemic in a lot of the countries. Does the HIR remain relevant to those situations, and how do you determine if a disease has become endemic or not early?
Yeah, it has to be a disease which is new or newly spreading. HIV doesn't qualify because if HIV had been detected much earlier, back in the early 20th century, then maybe something could have been done. But by the time it was detected, it was already spread throughout the world. So HIV wouldn't have fit in that. But, you know, I think that the HIV experience is what made countries more interested in trying to develop partnerships to stop the spread of diseases. So I think it served a very important function. But that didn't answer what you wanted.
No, that was the example that wouldn't fit the bill, but H5N1 still does.
Yeah.
Get IHR, but it's been around for 14 years.
Yeah.
And it's still a new disease.
That's right. And in the meantime, swine flu came in, and the IHR were used in swine flu because the pandemic was declared through the international health regulations. So the regulations are there, but they weren't used for H5N1. Remember, the Indonesian minister didn't use it. But should there be sustained human-to-human transmission, the IHR will play a role again, and things will change. But the IHR are weak in one thing, and that is that they don't provide for sharing of vaccines or goods. They only provide for sharing of information and strains. So it is a weakness. You know, countries they're set up to help stop the international spread of disease, yet they don't provide the tools that countries need to do it. Countries are expected to provide them themselves. But that's just the nature of today's world. We have to all strive to increase sustained access of all goods to all countries.
David, if I could, I have another question for you. One of the things you said in your talk reminded me of something D.A. Henderson said a couple weeks ago about how it is that if you're doing this kind of work, there are going to be times when you need to break the rules, and what you should do then is go ahead and do it, but be ready to apologize afterward. And you added to that, it's sort of like the rule about breaking rules. You added to that by saying that you should also have some evidence to show why it was necessary,
of course,
to break the rules. And
but DA wouldn't agree with that.
Okay. Well, in both cases, it seems to me, you know, you're presenting in a very positive way how it is that you need to be, you need to be flexible, and you need to be to show initiative and so on, and that's all commendable. But can you think of some examples where that readiness to break the rules had less salutary consequences, where some negative lessons about how it is?
I think clearly the fact that China broke the rules and didn't report SARS was a good example of how it can happen in the other way. I think they broke the rules, SARS became a pandemic. So, there are consequences, both positive and negative. But that's why I say you need the evidence before you break a rule.
Well, especially in working for an organization like WHO, in many cases these rules reflect the principle of state sovereignty, right? And so the WHO, is nothing if it's not accountable to the member states. So, if you think of it that way, there are many who would say more generally that in the whole realm of international development assistance, to think of it that way, that all too often, international organizations and NGOs are ready to override, kind of local government structures and so on. And so that is kind of a more general problem. So we have these really positive examples of leaders like D.A. Henderson and others, who are ready to be flexible, to put it that way. But nonetheless, it may be part of a larger problem.
It's a big problem. It's an ethical problem. I mean, is it ethical to be giving AIDS drugs when we don't know that that can be sustained in the long term? Mm-hmm. Is it ethical to be doing that now? Mm-hmm. The ethics of post-conflict situations and healthcare and just in general of outbreaks are really interesting because, the CDC, where I come from, goes in and does an outbreak investigation every time there's an outbreak at the invitation of the country, but then they take the data out and it's worked on back in the U.S. Is that ethical? Is that ethical? If you find that this disease was caused by something which could be prevented, is it ethical to have done the investigation and not provided the vaccine to prevent it? A whole series of ethical issues, very important ethics. And I'm not clear on all of them, but I'm working right now at Chatham House, which is a political think tank in London, with a guy named Lillywhite, who used to be the Surgeon General of the UK military, like our Surgeon General here. And he's very interested in this issue, and we're working right now with the Qatari government to try to look at the ethics in post-conflict situations so that when Libya needs support, they'll get it. That's Qatar's goal, but we're working with them on that. So it's a very important issue.
Okay. All right.
I think most would agree that I think health can be construed as a human rights issue, right? And furthermore, with these recent scares with bioweapons and such, health is definitely also a security issue. And so, given how much pull the UN has in the areas of human rights and security, why hasn't the UN taken they have so much legal pull in those areas, right? So international legal pull at least. So why hasn't the UN taken a more active role in enforcing these IHR mandates that we've been talking about that have such weak sort of legal force behind them?
Because there's no structure for the UN to be strong. There's no way it can be strong. And so it has to be done by setting up standards and norms and forcing people into a mold. But it just can't be done. But repeat some of your question again, because I thought of something else while you were talking.
Well, I guess my point was that global health is so intricately tied into security and human rights, which are things the UN has great international legal authority with.
That's right.
You know?
But human rights, in many instances, turn off the people you're trying to convince. And human rights is a very politically charged word, and it can often have the contrary effect to what you say. But it's clear that there's an obligation in a world where there are vaccines and drugs that are being used in industrialized countries and controlling infectious diseases. We have a moral obligation to make access sustainable throughout the world. Whether that's a human right or not, I don't know, but it certainly is a moral obligation.
So wait, given what you just said, would you agree with this whole FAO seed bank model thing that
Sure. I
would,
because the countries agreed to it.
But isn't that more monetarily driven rather than this whole human rights line?
Well, but it's a sustainable process. Yeah. Money has to sustain something that's human right. A human right can't be a human right unless you can provide you have the money to provide what's needed in order to make that right available to everyone. I think that's my.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank David Heymann again. Thank you very much. And
if any of you have any questions, you can email me. I'm happy to answer it.
Okay. And I'd like to encourage you all to come next week when we'll have Vincent Rassaniello. So hope to see you again next week.